From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that shape our world. I'm Mike Cosper, the director of CT Media. With me, as always, is Dr. Russell Moore, CT's editor-in-chief. Today, we're going to be taking a look back at 2022. What stands out, what mattered, what shaped the year, and we're going to look a little bit ahead to 2023. We'll also end today with a segment from CT's Daniel Silliman called Hey Daniel, What's Weird? Stay with us. All right, Russell, before we get into the show, you should know I'm a bad procrastinator when it comes to Christmas presents. So last week, I'm sitting there thinking, what am I going to do for a Christmas present for Dr. Russell Moore? I started Googling around, trying to figure out what I'm going to buy, and I found the perfect thing, something that will endure, a gift from the blockchain. It was an NFT with former President Donald Trump wearing a cowboy hat and riding a velociraptor, something that will endure for generations. Unfortunately, they were sold out, but hopefully it's the thought that counts.
Have to get on the waiting list, especially the velociraptor ones, I'm sure, because it's so on the nose.
Exactly. All right, on to a more serious topic. You sent me an article earlier this week by Adam Sternberg. This is the cultural editor from the New York Times, called The Year We Lost It. And the article's really about all of the ways that anger has pervaded throughout 2022. He starts with the infamous Will Smith slap of Chris Rock and kind of traces out all these other experiences of anger, all the ways anger has kind of attracted attention as well. There are Instagram accounts that are exclusively about, people losing it in restaurants or traffic. There's one called People Getting Mad that I see shared all the time. I wonder what stood out to you about that article?
Well, I think that article in conjunction with, and you and I also talked about this earlier this week, the words of the year as chosen by Merriam-Webster and by somebody else. I know Merriam-Webster's word of the year was gaslighting, and the other word of the year was goblin mode. I think the two of those together really do represent something of the sense of powerlessness in the culture right now of people who just feel as though there's no option but to freak out. And so you see that in politics, you see it in churches, you see it in families. Just the other night, I was dealing with, I think, one after the other of about 5 different either churches or friend groups or families. They were just completely at each other's throats. And I think that some of that has to do with fear. I mean, the article talks about a psychopathic clown as being sort of the representative of the age in the way that maybe Godzilla would have been the representative of the nuclear age, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers as a representative of the McCarthyite communist threat age. And it really does seem that that's the case, that there's a great deal of fear and I think a great deal of self-protection combined with this sense. I mean, I think all the time about, this has probably been 10 years ago, that there was a study about road rage. Colorado State University did, and it said you can't predict it on the basis of age of the driver, gender, make of the car. The only predictor is whether or not there are bumper stickers on the car. And the more bumper stickers there are, the more likely that person is going to tip over into rage. And the speculation was it's because the kind of person that feels the need to broadcast their opinions on things to total strangers are people more given to anger. Well, you think about it, that is the entire American culture right now. And you add to that COVID, the Trump years, this sense of unpredictability, that leads to an angry time.
Yeah, I thought that this horror movie reference that he made was pretty interesting because there's a flip side to that. Actually, there's a great book by a guy named Grant Morrison. He's a comic book writer who's written really some of the best stuff in the last 20 years. It's called Super Gods. And what he traces that's interesting is in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism, with the rise of pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe, you have these first-generation American children of immigrants, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Bob Kane, Jack Kirby, Joe Simon. These are the creators of Superman, Batman, Captain America, all of these sort of almost messianic hope responses to the crises of those times. You mentioned Godzilla as well, the nuclear age, like Spider-Man and the Hulk, who emerged in the 1960s. These are heroes created by radiation that are working for good in those ages. And what Grant Morrison gets at is that these are our modern myths that respond to cultural crises and global crises and provide some kind of expression of hope, expression of transformation in the moment. And so as I read his reference to this Japanese clown movie that became an American sensation with a remake, it just made me think a lot about what the flip side of that looks like. What does hope look like on the other side of this anger and this crazy season?
Yeah. Morrison points out in Super Gods, and of course, Grant Morrison is a quirky guy. So he has some out there ideas sometimes, but he has this idea about the positioning of the sun, solar cycles that kind of cycle us through these periods of hope or edgy, sort of dark despair. So he uses the illustration of, if you think about Batman 1966, campy, Adam West, funny, bright colors, as opposed to The Dark Knight, very much a more foreboding, dark tone.
Right.
Or even what Morrison did with Watchmen, which was kind of deconstructing superhero myths with this really dark, cynical view of human nature. His argument is that tends to cycle back and forth. And that might be one of the problems that we have right now in American life or in church life, is we seem to be kind of stuck in the dark. And there has to be a reaction to that. I think we've seen a little bit of that. I think about at the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, there was a reunion show of Parks and Rec that I remember. They just came on by Zoom when we were all in lockdown and sang Bye Bye Little Sebastian and the whole thing. And I found myself crying. And I said to myself, why am I crying? And it was because just the sheer sincerity of it was so different from what we had been seeing. So I think we see little flashes of that, but it's gone on for a long time with the dark.
Yeah, our family had a similar kind of response to John Krasinski would do this show on YouTube called Some Good News. That was the similar kind of thing. Like, here are the good things that are happening. And it was very sort of joyful and lighthearted. And I think people crave it. And, I disagreed with a little bit of the thread that he took on anger and the roots of anger, because I guess I should say, like, he makes some reference to it, to be fair to him. But in psychology, they often talk about anger as a secondary emotion, and it's an emotion that feels safe as compared to expressing things like sadness, depression, disappointment, grief.
Yeah.
And I've thought a ton about grief, and for personal reasons in my life, grief is something I've had to reckon with during this time with the loss of my father. You think about all the loss of this COVID season. Everybody knows people who've died. Oftentimes you're seeing the polarization get so extreme that family relationships are broken up, church communities are broken up, the learning loss with your kids, the loss of milestones, families who didn't get to have graduations, didn't get to have their first dance. The list could go on and on. And to me, it strikes me that we have this culture of pent-up grief, but because America doesn't do grief well, we look for these more sort of aggressive kinds of expressions of emotion that often do turn up in anger. Oftentimes in American culture, it turns into innovation. It turns into creativity. So I am very curious in terms of how it develops, but I think it reflects a lack of spiritual leadership and even political leadership in the country, that we don't know how to respond to the moment with expressions of grief and sorrow.
Yeah, I mean, you think about how startling it was this week when Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke to joint session of Congress, and just the way he was using rhetoric. David Frum has a great piece in The Atlantic this week sometime talking about the way that Zelensky came in and kind of called America to be America. and kind of tapped into that sense of the United States as the best example of ourselves, the people who landed at D-Day and the people who defeated the Soviet Empire and so forth, in a way that was striking right now, in a time when there's kind of this social Darwinist sense of hyper vulnerability and hyper self-protectiveness that I think is what is often behind this anger. And that's what we're seeing right now. People are at an exhaustion point of just feeding themselves with the adrenaline and the anger. It can't go on this way. It has to end in something else. And so that's what I'm hoping for, is that we'll see a shift to vulnerability and sincerity in 2023.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question of anger is an interesting one with Christians. I remember as a pastor years back, you would watch things happen online, and especially sort of in the early days of Facebook and Twitter, you'd see these sort of eruptions of whether it was debate or various sort of rants, and people just being very, very harsh in ways that make you think, like, gosh, like this doesn't reflect good things on character. It doesn't look good for the witness of the church, et cetera. And when you'd confront it, people would say, well, Jesus confronted the Pharisees. It says, be angry, but do not sin. God was angry. There's this sort of Christian line of justification for a lot of anger. I'd love to hear you just reflect on that a little bit. How do you think about the role of anger in terms of what is often sort of baptized in the language of holy anger, righteous anger?
Well, again, like almost every other dangerous thing, it's partly true. Because it is true that the Bible gives range to the full spectrum of human emotion, including anger. Jesus is angry several places in the Gospels. And when you don't have that, when you don't have any understanding of anger, then what happens is you tend to redirect it. And a lot of people redirect anger toward themselves. I mean, a lot of what depression is in many cases is redirected, self-directed anger. So that is true. Problem is, whenever you have people sort of referencing Jesus overturning the tables in the temple courts, it's almost always the case that you should walk backward out of the room slowly, because this is usually somebody with some deep psychological sorts of problems trying to find a justification for attacking. And so there's something true about it, but it's often like the person who wants to break up his or her marriage on the basis of, well, 1 Corinthians 13 tells us about the importance of love. And I found this other person that I love. Well, that's not what that means. And really, the startling thing about Jesus is not those few moments when we see flashes of anger, but the way that he is tranquil, especially when it comes to his own hurt at the arrest or standing before Pilate. That's what is remarkable, because that tranquility is ultimately grounded in confidence. I mean, when Peter comes out with the sword and wants to start attacking, Jesus says, don't you know I could ask my Father who'd send 12 legions of angels? And so he exposes the fact that a lot of this, especially the more theatrical and adrenal kinds of anger, really are a lack of confidence in God, in other people, in oneself. It's like everything else, there's a kind of equilibrium where if you have a church or a Christian community that says, we're scared of anger, let's not talk about anger at all, then you end up with really malformed, angry people in passive-aggressive ways. And if you have a church that says anger is enlivening, which is, I think, a lot of what's going on right now. There's such a lack of spiritual vitality. People can't feel alive through the ordinary means of grace. So the way they do it is by stimulation of the anger capacities that can help somebody who's lonely, isolated, failing, feel like Martin Luther or some other historic battling kind of figure. But it's like porn. It doesn't lead to anything real. It's just a stimulation of neural responses in ways that ultimately harm you. And I think that's what's going on right now in so many segments of Christian life.
Yeah. Dallas Willard had a great line where he said, the difference between Jesus's anger and ours is that we can trust Jesus with his anger,
Yeah.
where we
Yeah.
need much more suspicion of our own. And I think
true.
that's part of what's missing in the quote unquote discourse. There's such a sort of spirit of certainty and righteousness in anger over issues that are very disputable among Christians, not to mention among citizens that share a common world. But we will be right back. All right, so the year is coming to an end. We're recording this on the Thursday before Christmas, and I imagine some people might be listening a few days after Christmas. So looking back at 2022, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stories that we thought mattered the most, issues that we thought mattered the most. I shot some questions your way. I've got some ideas as well. Looking backward, what do you think mattered for the church in 2022?
I think part of what mattered to the church was the larger political context. What's happening with Donald Trump? Is this actually a loosening of his hold upon particularly white evangelical Christianity or not? Is it just a post-Access Hollywood sort of lull? I think that's going to matter quite a bit in 2023 and 2024. But also, I think the breakup of denominations, that we see this theme taking place of denominations that are melting down, whether it's the United Methodist Church splitting apart over sexuality issues, the Southern Baptist Convention in scandal and decline over sexual abuse issues and other things, the anger quotient we talked about a little bit earlier, and many other sort of denominational and ministry structures that are proving themselves to be really fragile. And I think that actually points to something bigger in American life, just as it did a lot of the Protestant denominational structures that we have in American life right now are the result of the years before the Civil War, when Northern groups and Southern groups were splitting apart. We may be seeing the same thing, just with different categories now. That's going to be something to watch, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think related to all of that, the end of Roe this year, just an enormous decision to, which has put abortion back at a state level. In some ways, it's reignited the abortion debate. But I sense that as a matter of sort of national politics, I think some of the fever around that's going to actually have burned out. And it sets the table for, you've had this conservative coalition that really came together maybe a decade or so after the Roe decision, maybe a little less than that. But this conservative coalition that came together where evangelicals really got locked in to that relationship with the Republican Party. And so I'm looking forward and wondering, now that that decision has been made, how much is that going to change that voting bloc? I doubt it opens the door to third party, but to different kinds of conversations about what it means to be conservative, what it means to be progressive or liberal. And thrown into the mix of everything else that's happening with populism inside both parties, to me, it just creates a whole lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
All right. So 2022 theology story of the year. Do you feel like there's something that sort of brought big theological questions to the forefront?
Well, I think the theological story is how little theology there actually was, even among the people who are the most theologically inclined. So you think about what the big controversies tended to be. They were either fake issues, such as critical race theory, moral panic taking place. There is such a thing as critical race theory, but it's not the way that it was being used in a demagogue-like fashion in many corners. The rise of Christian nationalism and the conversations around that. Many of these things, theology is almost a covering of things that are much more primal and fallen. I think we're accustomed to seeing that in the populist masses of church life. What I think we see right now is that the so-called theologians are often adapting themselves to that as well. And so we don't see very much careful reflection or theology at all.
Yeah, that was almost exactly one of my own notes, is that theological conversations have been supplanted by cultural issues, political issues, and amongst people who normally would be talking about those things. Even inside denominations, the splits aren't necessarily being defined by theological issues as much as sort of being driven from the other direction, from the cultural direction. All right, 2022 political takeaway. We've had the midterm elections and too much to list in terms of and to recount. What do you take away from 2022?
Democracy is not dead. And I mean, the idea of protecting democracy in a bipartisan way, that's not dead. If you look at who the big losers were in 2022, they were election-denying democracy skeptics. And this is after an entire year of people saying, people don't care about this. They don't care about the constitutional order. They don't care about the January 6th committee and their findings. You need to just move on from that. Well, the American people did. And one of the things that you'll notice in every one of these close elections was that in many cases, the margin of error was being decided by Republicans who said, we're not going to go for this. So you can see really mainstream pro-democracy, sorts of very conservative Republicans, such as Mike DeWine, winning very easily. And you see the election deniers, Blake Masters, Carrie Lake, Doug Mastriano, others, losing. And so I think that was a key takeaway. We're not as far down the anti-democracy authoritarian sort of line as some of us feared.
Yeah, I think the other reality that we saw in all of this is that nobody's really that popular either.
Yeah.
A lot of the margins are incredibly small. The voters have delivered, divided government. And there's a podcast called Call Me Back. It's hosted by a guy named Dan Senor. And he had Yuval Levine on, who I know is a friend of yours. And, this was one of Yuval's big points, is that we don't have the same kind of parties that you once had in the past. You have two minority parties that are very unpopular, that have learned to cater to their most radical bases. And as a result, sort of the majority of the country is looking at both of these and seeing extremes on one side saying things like, abolish ICE, defund the police 2 years ago, and looking today at things like you saw in the election denials or the nominations of people like Mastriano and Herschel Walker and saying this is appalling as well. So I think the takeaway ought to be thoughtfulness on the part of party leaders on either side to say, is there a way to build a coalition that's broader than this radical base? And I think, there's all kinds of reasons in terms of party politics why that's going to be really difficult. All right, 2022 was the end of an era for fill in the blank.
Complementarianism as we know it. And for those who aren't familiar with this is the argument going on for a long time within evangelical circles about the role of women in church life. And I say that as somebody who is a complementarian of a type. But what we saw was that the divisions between complementarianism as a party, we're not for women in pastoral ministry, and egalitarianism as a party, we are for women in pastoral ministry, aren't actually where the divisions are. So you ended up seeing people who were egalitarians who are saying, I'm an egalitarian, and I believe that Father, Son, Holy Spirit are categories we ought to keep. And I believe that there are differences between men and women that are important. And you have a lot of us who are complementarians looking around and saying, wait a minute, there actually is a lot of misogyny and hurting of women here. There actually is a price that is being paid for the fact that women are not at a lot of these tables. And so I think all of those old coalitions are being remixed in some interesting ways for the years ahead.
All right, what do you want to hear more about in 2023?
I would like to hear more about institution building in the right way in 2023, because I think one of the things that we've seen over the past several years is this ironic convergence of both institutional self-protection that turns evil, which is what we have seen with a lot of the tribalism, a lot of the abuse cover-ups, a lot of the ways that, even the cryptocurrency scams that you're talking about, ways that institutional structures can be used to harm. along with the evaporation of institutions. One of the reasons that we're in this time of demagogues and authoritarians is because we don't have political party structures. FDR and Ronald Reagan came about largely because there were grown-ups who were able to say, these are the kind of people who can win and who can lead, and we don't have a lot of that. So I think being able to see institutions that are accountable and don't have their own perpetuation as their primary goal, and yet are actually working, that's what I would like to see in 2023.
Yeah, mine is I want to hear more about AI. I am the whole AI phenomenon, some of the stuff you're seeing, the ability of AI to write these papers, the art, the whole rest of it. That stuff's interesting. Its implications are, to me, very serious, very concerning. There was a story a few weeks ago about police robots and a desire to give them, lethal authority. And I'm a child of the 90s. I just want all these people to go watch RoboCop and Terminator and The Matrix again, because all of this is going to end in tears. 2023, what do you want to hear less about?
I would love to hear less about Donald Trump in 2023. I don't expect that will happen. But I have many friends who are saying, well, now is the time that the country's moving on from this. I don't buy it just because I've lived through that before with Access Hollywood, with January 6th, with so forth. And a lot of the people who seem to be moving on, it's out of a really cynical sense of, well, this person isn't winning anymore, and therefore we're just going to retroactively have this idea that we never were really with this. I would like to hear less about that and back to the real sorts of arguments that we might have as Americans about how to make the country better. Yeah. I don't expect that to be the case, but it would be nice.
Yeah, no, I heartily agree with that one. And I also heartily agree with the don't hold your breath sort of sentiment in there as well, because I just look at it and I see Trump being Trump. Even the NFT thing, goofy as it was, I just don't see him having put his foot on the gas yet. Maybe he won't, but he's not doing the rallies. He's not doing a lot of the stuff that tends to sort of drum up the base. And I think that should he decide to put his foot in the gas in that way, I think we'll see more of it. Mine, I'm going to get in trouble for this one, I think, with a lot of folks. I want to hear less about Taylor Swift next year. I know people love Taylor Swift. She's incredibly talented. I get it. But I just personally don't necessarily get the degree of the hype. And I had a friend I was talking to about this stuff the other day, and it came up, and I kind of rolled my eyes. And he runs a small business, and he and his wife, and they cater primarily to women, this sort of boutique manufacturing thing that they do. And he said, what's crazy about the Swift phenomenon is that if you're in our world, literally every small business, every business that caters to women had to do a Swift-inspired line this fall because it's all people were wanting to talk about. So I don't have that problem necessarily. I just feel like, man, it's just all Taylor Swift all the time, and I'm ready to move on. Let's get some new music going.
I laughed because there's a new biography of Merle Haggard that came out last year, and talking about in some of his final days, he was recording a song, and the producer said, I loved it because it really sounded Merle Haggard. And Haggard said, well, who the heck did you think was singing? Taylor Swift? And that was his contrast. And so I tend to think of that every time I hear Taylor Swift now.
All right. Well, before we wrap this up, what would you say you look forward to most for 2023?
I look forward to churches healing. And I don't know that will happen, but that's what I pray for, that a lot of the churches that are either literally divided or are just psychologically and spiritually tense, that there will be some healing and some renewing of mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm somewhat optimistic about that. And I share that a little bit. I mean, one of the things I love about, I'm a big New Year's resolutions guy. I always sort of come to the new year and think about what do I want to commit myself to? And, I'm not one of these people that's like, here's my 5 goals and I track them or whatever. I'm just not organized enough to do that sort of thing. But I think you see in scripture and you see in Christian tradition and you see in Jewish tradition as well, this idea that there are seasons for a purpose. There's sort of inflection points in our year, Christmas, New Year's, Easter. They're meant to be moments where we sort of pause and look ahead. And I think as well, the Psalm, his mercies are new each morning. I think that that goes for the new year as well. There's a new mercy for what's ahead. And my hope and prayer is that the church comes into this new year and seizes the opportunity to build something better and more beautiful.
May it be. We'll be right back right after this quick break.
All right, we are back with a regular segment featuring one of CT's news editors, Daniel Silliman, and we call this segment, Hey Daniel, What's Weird? So Daniel, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us what is weird this week?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to tell you a little Christian history about faith when everybody's lost hope. This is the story of Cotton Mather's Moon Men on the Moon. Mather, of course, everybody's favorite American sci-fi writer. No, he was a Puritan preacher, late 17th century, early 18th century, most known for sort of consulting in the Salem witch trials. But he was really interested in the science of his day. He was the first person who promoted smallpox vaccines. He did some work on figuring out bird migration, which people did not understand at the time. They just knew the birds all disappeared and then came back, which is fun. But he was especially interested in telescopes and, emerging astronomy. And at this point, people started having good telescopes, but had no idea what they were going to see. So they're like looking at the moon thinking, are we going to see cities? Are we going to see canals? Are we going to see people waving back at us? Like, what's going on? A really interesting thing to me is that Mather wanted to use this science for speculation for theological education. So there's a time in his life, this is like the late 1600s, 1680s, where he is just kind of losing faith in the Puritan project. People are falling away. People are making bad decisions. People are not winning where he thinks they should be winning. There's a Catholic king returning to the throne in England. And Mather is also generally pessimistic. He's just kind of pessimistic in his bones. And so he starts thinking, well, what happens if everybody loses faith? What happens if there are no Christians left? How can that be that seems like a plausible end that we're facing? And he thinks, well, I know that God is going to be glorified. So how could it be that there are no Christians left, maybe, that the apocalypse comes, Jesus comes back to the earth, and there is no faith on the earth, as Jesus himself raises that possibility in the scripture. And he comes up with this thing, which he writes in his commentary on the book of Revelation. Well, maybe there are men on the moon. Maybe there are humans or some other species who are on the moon looking down at us. And when the apocalypse comes and fire comes and there's no faith on the earth and the mountains are melting and the mountains are falling on people, as it says in Revelation, those people will look at us and say, God is just and God is glorified. And maybe our failure will actually be the thing that brings glory to God. So it's obviously a little different today, but sometimes when I'm feeling pessimistic in my bones, having a Cotton Mathery kind of day, I think of his Moon Men. Think of his alien species that's glorifying God because of our human failings.
Man, I mean, that one's got everything. It's got the moon. It's got vaccines. Wow. Yeah.
Witch trials. Everything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we asked and you answered. That was definitely a weird one.
Did that go weird enough for you? No.
I can't say I had Puritan speculation about extraterrestrials on my bulletin bingo card.
I just felt like you needed that in your life, Mike. Like you just needed, I know sometimes you get depressed about the state of things, and I just wanted to give you this gift of Cotton Mather's aliens.
And I just wish we had the rights to REM's Man on the Moon for our outro music.
I know, it'd be a perfect outro, wouldn't it? So, been thinking about it the whole time. It's interesting to me, too, in terms of the way you hear a number of writers and thinkers today talk about science fiction as kind of one of the last places where transcendent ideas kind of, there's a certain sense of mystery that gets explored ironically, inside of sci-fi. Seems like there's an interesting thread there to Mather's speculation about this stuff.
It's a good prompt if there are any Christian sci-fi readers listening who want to take their hand at a story. This is a good premise for them.
All right, Daniel. Well, we asked and you answered. That one was pretty weird.
Happy to contribute.
Thanks for being with us. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Bulletin this year. It's been fun launching the show. We really look forward to what's happening in 2023. But we're going to take a week off for the Christmas break. And before we do that, we just wanted to take a moment to wish you a Merry Christmas, not just from us, but from a number of our colleagues here at CT.
Hi, I'm Abigail Erickson, and I'm a graphic designer. Wishing you a Merry Christmas from sunny Southern California. One of my unique Christmas traditions is doing a Swedish smorgasbord with my family for Christmas. We eat a lot of interesting food like pickled herring and peppercocker cookies, and it's a lot of fun.
Hi, I'm Isabel, the Asia Associate Editor, wishing you a Merry Christmas from Vancouver, Canada. One unique tradition for my family is that we will drive up to Whistler to spend Christmas there for a day or two. I'm born and raised in Singapore, where it never ever snows, so experiencing a white Christmas is pretty special.
I'm Ed Gilbreth, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, wishing you a Merry Christmas from soon-to-be snowy Chicago. Best childhood Christmas gift I received was the Fisher-Price Sesame Street set. Sesame Street was special to me because it was the first program I could remember that sort of showed the diversity of the world and the idea of community.
I'm Morgan Lee, Global Media Manager at Christianity Today, wishing you a Merry Christmas from beautiful Hawaii. One of my favorite Christmas traditions is karaoke, which is essentially a Christmas karaoke party. It is a time of the year when you bring your friends together and either joyfully and harmoniously sing Christmas carols, or you can work everyone up into a fervor, incorporate pots and pans, and sing your heart out without any attention to the notes that you are singing. Both work and both are awesome.
I'm Sean Chen, CT Asia Editor, wishing you a Merry Christmas from Baltimore, Maryland. One of the favorite things we loved to do was going to Princeton Theological Seminary for their Christmas concert. And we would enjoy listening to Christmas songs in different languages sung by international students from all over the world.
I'm Judy Sather, Vice President of Human Resources, wishing you a Merry Christmas from blizzardy Geneva, Illinois. While most families are singing O Christmas Tree or O Tannenbaum, our family gathers around a Norwegian feast and sings O Lutefisk, O Lutefisk. How fragrant your aroma.
Hi there, this is Joy Almond, Editorial Chief of Staff at CT. I am speaking to you from Music City, right here in Nashville, Tennessee, and I wish you a Merry Christmas. I grew up on the coast of North Carolina. Where I come from, seafood's really important. Our Christmas dinner, it's always surf and turf, emphasis on the surf.
Hello, I'm Christine Kolb, and I serve as Executive Assistant to President and CEO Tim Dalrymple, to Editor-in-Chief Russell Moore, and also our Chief Creative Officer Eric Petrick. And I come wishing you a Merry Christmas from beautiful, very cold, and about to be very snowy Chicago. One of the things that I love about Christmas is my family's tradition of Swedish smorgasbord on Christmas Eve. And the best part of that for me is the rice pudding. From all of us at CT, we want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as we join our voices with the global church, praying that in 2023 we would see God's grace and unity in a way that we have not experienced it before.
We would see our clergy and congregations blessed with power to be ministers of love and healing.
praying the persecuted churches in China will continue to persevere and grow.
That light will pierce the darkness.
Peace within the church.
Greater unity and hope.
We would become the answer to Jesus' prayer in John 17, that his church may be one.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producer Eric Petrick. Host and producer Mike Cosper. Producer and editor Azure Phelps. Additional editing and operations Matt Stevens. Music, editing, and mix Dan Phelps. Graphic design Brian Todd. Social media Kate Lucky.